for the research of the book, I spent some time, almost a year, reading the history of the two countries in terms of local governance. Because a lot of people would think, okay, so China is more territorial and India is democratic, and the polity of the logic of urban governance has a stronger associational character. So maybe these are um, these can be traced back to 1947 or 1949 when the two countries became independent. And so I read and read the historiography on local governance in the two countries. And to my own surprise, I actually traced back the origins of the territorial and associational approaches to governing local affairs far back in the history. And for the Chinese case, the hukou, for example, I'll use the hukou case as an example. Everybody, I think if you lived in Shanghai even for a week, you know what hukou is. But so the hukou system was implemented by the Communist Party in the 1950s. So that's true. However, it's not an invention by the Communist Party. It can be traced back to the Song dynasty in the 11th century. So, so what happened back then? The Song dynasty, the Song court, central government was weak, and there was a big reformer called Wang Shi, and he led reforms in different issue areas. And one of the reforms is hukou, and they didn't use the word hukou. It's under a different name. It's called the Baojia system, but it's the same idea. So the yellow picture you see on my screen, that's how hukou looked like in the late Qing dynasty. So here, if you read Chinese, so this is, it says how many people living in this household, their names, and their address, and also the year when they were registered. So this is from the late 19th, early 20th century, late Qing period. So the point here is that China, if we look at Chinese cities today, urban governance has a very strong territorial logic, but that goes a long way back in the history. And from the imperial period to the socialist era, to the market reform era, and to the contemporary period, in every major historical phase, there has been new invention by the state, by the Chinese state, new inventions of territorial tools or forms of governance. In the socialist era, so for example, Danwei was a major invention. Danwei means work unit. I grew up in Danwei in the Northeast. And then the most recent example of a territorial approach to governing cities is the grid governance system. In Chinese, it's called 网格化管理. So that has been super powerful for containing the COVID-19 pandemic. I don't know it depends on where you live, but for almost all urban neighborhoods, they are under some surveillance of the grid governance system. So basically, for cities like Shanghai, the entire city is divided into, I don't know the number, probably more than 2,000 grids. And every grid is about between 1 and 2 square kilometers. And the government knows exactly how many buildings and how many households live in each grid. And for every residential building, there are people appointed from the city, from the district government, and also from other government agencies such as the court. So the Chinese court is part of the government, and that's a bit different from India. And also there are volunteers. So there are many eyes watching every residential building. and it's been working pretty well to keep the COVID numbers down, because there are so many people watching. If there are new infections in the building, then the infected would be hauled away to quarantine centers. So it's one of the major strategies China used to contain the pandemic. And it's deeply territorial, because basically the idea is you divide a city into many, many small cells, and then you try to control each cell in a very profound and deep way. So it's a deep penetration of state power in local urban neighborhoods. But my larger point here is the territorial forms of governing cities can be traced far back in the history. For each historical period, there are old forms and there are also new inventions. And for India, I apologize for this very boring table, but the point is, again, it's a similar story. So the associational way, the associational logic of governing local affairs can be traced back far many years ago. So for example, in the Mughal period, even before the British, the localities in India, for most parts, were ruled by, if it's rural areas, so there were zamindars, tax collectors. And for cities, there were very wealthy merchants. So they are called the urban rais, RAIS. So they were the local territorial elites. However, their authority was always challenged by other competing competing powers. For example, religious leaders or caste leaders, leaders of different professions, leaders of different migrant groups. And their power was quite substantial. So there was no single authority in charge in managing local affairs. And for the subsequent colonial period, and then after 1949, after 1991, after liberalization, so Indian cities still have municipal governments, but it's the same story. The municipal authority has been weak for centuries, and there are always other powers that try to challenge municipal governments. For example, today, after in the most recent current era post-liberalization, so if you look at the people or groups or organizations actually in charge, a lot of them, in many cases, it's not municipal governments. For example, in large places like Delhi, if you look at the urban periphery like Noida or other new towns, so those places are governed by non-representative state agencies. The officials are not elected. For example, Noida Development Authority. It's a state agency, but they are not the leaders, the bureaucrats in those agencies are not elected. And they do not necessarily work together with the Delhi government. So, the point here is that there has always been municipal authority in the Indian case, but their power is always challenged and very fragmented, because there are many other players on the table. So to make things happen, people need to build alliances, build networks, and therefore the larger picture is associational. So you need to form a coalition, have your own network to achieve what your specific agenda.